So a big part of my job when teaching my grinding courses or visiting companies and spending time on the shop floor is dealing with coolant application. And a lot of people have a lot of ideas about coolant application, and they think, oh, if I got burn, the solution is better cooling. If I've got too high temperatures and cracking, I got to improve the cooling. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. In fact, most of the time, if you have burn and you have bad cooling, if you improve your cooling, you're not going to help things. So cooling is important, but let's take a look at when cooling is important and when it's not. So I'll show up at a company and Joe the grinder will say, hey, I watched your grinding dock video. You said we should get the coolant velocity close to the wheel velocity. We should aim at the interface and all that. We're not doing any of that. We have really bad coolant application. And I say to Joe the grinder, don't worry about it, man. We got other things to deal with. Fixing the coolant, improving the coolant is not going to help things, and in fact, in some cases, it might even hurt things. But the next day I may go to a different company and they'll say, hey, grinding dock, we saw your video. We've got terrible coolant application. The coolant velocity is not matching the wheel velocity. We're not even close. We're not even aiming it well. And I'll say, yeah, man, we got to work on that cooling. In fact, we got to put a lot of energy into improving that coolant application. So why do I sometimes say, hey, Joe the grinder, you got crappy cooling and it doesn't matter? And why do I sometimes say, hey, Bud the button pusher, you got crappy cooling and we really got to fix that? Well, it has to do with how much heat can we actually suck out of the coolant. So here's the hot spot in grinding. Right here, temperatures can get 1,000 degrees C, 1,100 degrees C. Rehardening occurs at 700, 800 degrees C. Residual tensile stresses start occurring at 500, 600 degrees C. This is where things get hot. And there's a very quick gradient where just a few microns away, thou of an inch away, the temperature is dropped drastically. So if we're going to cool well, we've got to get coolant within the pores of the wheel. Don't want to cool over there. We don't want to cool over there. We got to get coolant in those pores of the wheel and to the hot spot if we want to cool well. And I'm not even saying we do want to cool well. And we do that by having the velocity of the coolant somewhere at least 80% of the velocity of the wheel if we want to cool well. But again, sometimes I say, don't worry about it, man. You got bad cooling and it doesn't matter. So what is the difference? And here's one of the key points of when I decide do we need to improve cooling or not. And that has to do with the arc length. The heat that we generate in grinding, some of that goes into the wheel. Aluminum oxide, almost nothing. Diamond and CBN, some. Some of that heat goes into the chips. Some of the heat goes into the workpiece, and some of the heat goes into the coolant. The amount of heat that goes into the coolant depends on this contact area. What we have is convective heat transfer. Q equals HA delta T. So how much heat can we actually suck out with the coolant depends on how much contact area we have, or more specifically, what is our arc length. If our arc length is long, we're going to suck out a lot of heat. If our arc length is short, we're not going to be able to suck much heat into the coolant. So if we're doing creep feed grinding, we have a super long arc length because we have a super deep depth of cut. So the coolant might suck out 70% of the heat. If I have a short arc length, like in surface grinding, coolant's going to suck out only, say, 20% of the heat. And if I have a super short arc length, as in cylindrical OD grinding, the coolant is going to suck out very, very little heat. So if I go to a company and they're doing creep feed grinding, I say, hey guys, you've got to improve your cooling, otherwise bad things are going to happen. If I go to a company and they're doing cylindrical OD grinding, I will usually say to them, hey, don't worry about it, mediocre is fine. And if you go from mediocre to good, you're probably not going to help your cause that much. But it gets more complicated than that, because we have the hydrodynamic force or the hydroplaning force or the push-off. So you say, hey man, well, I still want to have good cooling in cylindrical OD grinding for two reasons. Number one, it'll cool a little bit better. Number two, I'll get better lubrication. Or number three, I'm going to get less loading. We'll talk about that in a minute. So if you have good cooling in a cylindrical OD grinding operation, that normal force pushing up on your spindle can be 100 pounds, 50 kilos of force pushing up on that spindle. And if you push up on your spindle, your wheel's going to deflect. If you push up on your spindle, of course, you're going to push back down on your workpiece. Your workpiece is going to deflect. If you got to hold tight tolerances, that can be a big problem. If you're doing cylindrical grinding, you can have issues with barreling, you can have issues with taper, a lot of other things. So you could make the argument that if you're doing cylindrical OD grinding, really good cooling is actually going to hurt you, at least in finish grinding. So one of the things that I encourage my customers to do, if they can do it, is during finish grinding, see if you can throttle back your coolant a little bit to decrease the hydroplaning forces to reduce that deflection. If you can. If it's not an issue, you're not holding tight tolerances, you don't have tapering, you don't have barreling, maybe it's not a problem. But then occasionally, I'll even go to a company doing cylindrical OD grinding, and they'll say, hey, you tell us we don't need good cooling because we have a short arc length, so why bother? And I go, yeah, that's true. They said, but what's your biggest issue? And they go, oh, we got burned because we're loading our wheel. So then I say, all right, well, you don't need good cooling to suck out heat because you're not going to suck out much heat because we have a short arc length, but you do need good cooling to reduce or slow down that loading effect. And that's what I call the cooling chip quench effect. So here's what happens. If I have bad cooling and I have a lot of air, not much coolant, I've got hot chips coming off of the grit. Hot chips are hot and sticky. Hot and sticky things stick to the wheel. Here comes another hot and sticky chip. That hot and sticky chip sticks to the previous hot and sticky chip. Here comes another hot and sticky chip. And next thing you know, I have a giant blob of loaded material on my wheel. So what's one of the best, or maybe even the best way to deal with loading, at least in ductile materials like nickel alloys, hard steels, soft steels, Inconels, stainless steel, stuff like that, one of the best ways is to get coolant in there. Now here's my hot sticky chip, and maybe he embeds himself right there, but now here comes another hot sticky chip, and if that hot sticky chip is met by cold coolant, we quench that hot sticky chip. That hot and sticky chip is now cold and brittle. Cold, brittle things don't stick as much, and now he's more likely just to fly off with the swarf. So now there's a situation, or there are situations I say, listen, we need better cooling because you have a loading issue. You're grinding stainless steel, you're grinding soft steel, hard steel, you got loading of the wheel. So we're going to battle that by cooling better, not because we're going to suck out heat with the coolant, but because we're going to get the chip quench effect to reduce the loading. So that's true with more ductile materials. The third benefit is stainless steels have chemical reactions that occur there that also cause loading. And if I can get coolant in there and quench that guy, or put a barrier between the grit and the workpiece, I will slow down the loading of the stainless steel too, due to the chemical reaction. So I've given you bunches of contradictory information. On one hand, I'm saying, hey, if you're doing crete feed grinding, you want good cooling. If you're doing cylindrical grinding, don't worry about it too much. If you're doing cylindrical ID, you can suck out a little more heat. But now we are going to have other issues possibly. In surface grinding, we're going to suck out a little heat. However, we may want to improve the cooling, not because we're going to suck out heat, but because we'll reduce loading. But then if loading is not an issue, we may want to actually cool not as well because of the hydroplaning force, and that's especially true in cylindrical ID, where we don't have a stiff spindle, we don't have a stiff workpiece, and we get a lot of deflection, so now good cooling can actually hurt us. So I've given you all this contradictory information. I've told you want good cooling, except when you don't want good cooling, and then maybe you want good cooling if you have loading, but then you don't want good cooling if you got hydroplaning, but if you have hydroplaning and loading, then maybe you need good cooling, or maybe you need it during spark out, but not during roughing. But in creep feed grinding, you always need good cooling. So we got to take these in a case-by-case basis and see what the story is and what's actually going on. And then decide on each case-by-case basis, how much heat can we actually suck out, how much loading are we getting, how much hydroplaning are we getting, and let's make some smart decisions about whether or not we want to improve our cooling.